Hello. Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
everyone. Yes, hi, everyone. Welcome to our new event today in July for at Microsoft Azure User Group Sweden. And today we also have, I would like to introduce you to our new organizer and co-host, Håkan. Welcome, Håkan.
Yeah, thank you
Good.
so much, Anna. we sh-
Yes.
we should also say that we have created this user group for anyone who has a topic that they are really passionate about. So and if even if you don't have a topic, but you want to have some coaching, me and Jonah can help you out and help you with how you can structure your presentation, because that's what we're here for. We're here for you, for the community, so that you can have a platform to talk from.
Yes.
So now today we have our first speaker here. So let's add him here to the stream.
Yes.
Hello, Peter.
Hey, good afternoon. How are you?
Yeah.
We're doing great, and it's we're so glad to have you here today in Azure User Group Sweden. And I believe you're in Belgium, right? You're sitting in Belgium right now.
Yes, that's right. And I actually wish I was in Sweden right now. It always
Yeah.
reminds me about good food, friendly people. Most of the time, actually, pretty nice weather. We're now in Belgium. It's raining, but it's probably gonna happen anytime soon, but not right now. But
Yes.
not gonna complain about it. But thanks for having me. I would
Yes.
say I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you want to say a couple of words here about what you will present tonight?
Oh, yeah, sure. So, well, I mean, you introduced it already that you're inviting speakers that are passionate about a specific topic to talk about. And I think I can say that Azure is my passion domain for the last 8, 9 years already. And then even more specific in Azure, I somehow fell in love with DevOps pipelines for about 2 years now, because it's really helping me in not only out of my day-to-day job, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but also how it helps customers onboarding to cloud. I think that's the main message, and that's why I came up with a title, enabling cloud magic by using Azure DevOps. And I hope I can show you with quite some demos. I got a few slides, but hopefully not too much slideware. That it's going to be a fun interactive session. You can ask questions whenever you want, so feel free to interrupt with any questions, comments. If you want to see something that I didn't have yet in a demo, and you got a question on that, I would say just shoot, and it probably will work out fine to show you at least something of it.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. So then,
Great.
just before we start, we actually got here a weather report from Oslo, from Ashish. He says that it's raining in Oslo as well.
Oh, okay. So Belgium or Sweden is not
Yes.
really a big difference, at least from a weather perspective.
Yes. We are actually just to Håkan is in Oslo or in Norway. And I am in Sweden. And we also have some guests watching Ashish. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, but he's from Oslo, I think. And also Gabriel. And I have another contact, Gopal. Welcome, Gopal. He is watching from India, I know.
Ooh, nice.
So it's really great that we're like many are watching or tuning in. So hopefully we'll get interactions from our audience.
Yeah, I think that's to come up with something positive in still the middle of the pandemic, I guess, is that out of the like virtual presentations, that it's been pretty amazing to have anyone from anywhere in the world connecting. Where if this would be in Sweden, which I think would still be a really cool thing, but then you probably have like the town local ones. Nobody's really like probably commuting for like 2-3 hours for like a 1 hour user group session on something Azure DevOps. Where now you get, like you said, someone from India coming in, someone from Oslo coming in. So actually pretty cool. So international user group. Awesome. You need to
Yes.
rebrand it.
Yeah, I know. I already created and signed up for the account and meetup when I realized that I should have had another name for that. But it's okay. We're flexible. And good thing we have this challenge with COVID that makes us diverse.
That's right.
Yeah.
So then
All
I
right.
think we can give the stage over here to you, Pete.
Yeah.
Good. Sounds good. Can you help me a little bit with time tracking? I know we got about 60 minutes. I don't really have to run, so if there's any questions at the end, then
Sure.
again, feel free to jump in with questions whenever it fits, or all the way at the end if we do have some time. But I want to make sure I can show everything that I want to talk about in roughly 60 minutes, so should be good. So once more, everyone, I would say welcome to my session, and once more, thank you for inviting me. As you know already, I'm pretty passionate about Azure, pretty passionate about Azure DevOps, and I'm going to try and share a little bit of that spark and the passion to you as well in the next 60-something minutes. So when you look at Azure DevOps, it's one of the tools, I would say, that allows you to enable DevOps for your organization. But maybe you're pretty new in maybe Azure world, maybe Azure DevOps world, and you go like, yeah, but what's this DevOps thing about, right? And it's not just Azure. I mean, if you're using on-prem infrastructure, if you're using AWS, Google Cloud, or any other hosting environment, you can still apply Azure DevOps best practices. And it's just helping you in optimizing, maybe creating a little bit of cloud magic. I hope I can show you some stuff. So in short, when you look at DevOps overall, it starts with source control. And I'll talk about each and every topic a little bit more in depth. Where source control is, I would say, the starting point of DevOps. It's having your application source code or your Azure templates, Terraform templates, Bicep templates. Anyone working with Bicep? Might be a question for the audience. Let us know in chat if you are already looking into Bicep. But that's really the starting point. You have your application, you have your infrastructure template, or maybe an Azure CLI script or a PowerShell script, and you want to move that into an Azure deployment. Where next, if you look at a little bit larger than just your own development environment, you're probably going to work with colleagues, DevOps engineers, and you need some kind of project management, where Azure DevOps is going to help you as well. Then obviously the core of the platform is the pipelines, where you could rebrand it to running deployments. Now, when you think about deployments, you always think about, I'm going to run something in a moving state, moving it into a test environment, production environment, running it anywhere in an Azure region, or again, AWS, Google Cloud, on-prem, doesn't really matter. And in between, you need some kind of source validation. Like, is my application working? Are my scripts been tested? So that kind of scenario I will zoom in on that as well. And then eventually running your deployments, but only when step 1, 2, and 3 are actually validated. And even there, you'll find out that Azure DevOps can help you. And then all the way at the end, it's, I would say, my personal branding, that I do like doing live demos. And if needed, I'll fall back on slides, but hopefully not too many. So that's going to be it. Now, if you're new to Azure, if you're new to Azure DevOps pipelines, and you go like, well, what's the purpose? Like, what can I do with it, right? So I came up with a couple of common scenarios. So the first one, you might have an ARM template or Terraform template or Bicep template or CloudFormation if you're targeting AWS, doesn't really matter. And you want to deploy your artifacts, you want to deploy your infrastructure together with your application into, for example, a virtual machine scenario. But maybe you want to move into a web application scenario, again, using Azure App Services or the counterpart in any other cloud environment. Or maybe, since the world is slightly moving to containers or already running on containers, depending how you look at it, you want to start from that same application source code that initially was running on VMs, and then moving to app service, and eventually running it on top of containers. And maybe you're thinking even one step further, where you want to deploy everything at once. Like, hey, maybe we can deploy some web app together with a SQL database in 5 Azure regions, or maybe in Azure and AWS at the same time. Or maybe you have some managers, or the project managers maybe, that want to watch over and approve your deployments before they kick off. And maybe you're looking in some deployment strategy where I already mentioned it's dev and test, staging, production, but it could be something different, like a canary deployment, early adopter. For the ones who are working with Windows Preview, where only 2 weeks ago Windows 11 previews came out, that could be seen as a canary deployment, which means that you're not going to wait for the full 100% production version, but you're already going to provide it to your users, your customers, depending on your scenario, and already allowing it to deploy. So that could be a different deployment strategy. And then thinking back about how pipelines can help you. And then maybe validating conditions of your deployment. An easy example that I'll try to show you is Azure Policies. It's an instrument in the platform that blocks you from deploying something into West Europe or Central US, or if you have an ARM template in which you define a specific app service plan, a database size, a virtual machine size, you're going to run the pipeline, it's going to start the deployment, and eventually it gets pushed back. Like, hey, Azure policy, I'm not allowing you to deploy this, right? And why would you run your deployment if you know that the policy is blocking you? Does make a lot of sense. And that's where, again, a little piece of magic comes in. And then last, I'm going to talk a little bit about security as well, where you probably want to make sure that your DevOps teams are actually creating or writing secure code and helping you with some Azure DevOps tools that could optimize the process. So a couple of scenarios. It should give you some idea about the demos I'm going to squeeze in as well. Maybe before jumping into the real technical topic, a little bit about myself. So Peter, based out of Belgium, and currently working at Microsoft as an Azure Technical Trainer for almost 2 years. I think in another 3-4 weeks from now, we'll start my 3rd year. And it's probably one of the easiest job roles within Microsoft, where it is literally providing Azure technical training every single week to our top customers and partners anywhere in the world, where for now it is obviously all virtual. And I'm mainly providing training on the architect level, and no surprise there, Azure DevOps as well. Before I joined Microsoft, I was running my own business for about 10 years as a Microsoft trainer, Azure architect, and did quite some deployments for customers all over the world. And besides that, in the little bit of free time that I had, which during my traveling season, I would say, or seasons across the years, typically meant in boring airports during the flight or in boring hotel rooms, I went back to my Azure passion and started writing some technical books. A couple of them are available for free if you're interested in getting a copy. Maybe let us know in chat, and more than happy all the way at the end to show you how you can find them. A couple of other ones, fortunately, are not available for free, but even there, I think we can probably give them away. Let's say, Hakan and Yona, we do a little game that the most interesting question that comes up at the end of the session, they get my Azure 2-tier application migration book for free. Cool, that's it. If you watch this as a recorded session or you don't want to post your question during the live session, feel free to reach out, petender@microsoft.com. I'm pretty active on Twitter @PDTIT, and I got my own blog website. It's a little bit outdated. I actually forgot to blog for about 2 months, but it's mainly because I'm busy with some other stuff. It's 007fflearning.com. And if you have no idea where that URL comes from, then I would say that's the second game. Cool. What is DevOps? DevOps is automation. DevOps is gluing the dev world and gluing the operations world together. There's a nice statement from our DevOps team within Microsoft where they talk about providing business value, providing value to your business, where it's around people, processes, and products. Easy said, you have your team, developers, you have your sysadmins, but that's not what DevOps is about. It's a lot broader than that. You have your project managers, you have the business, you have a marketing team that's going to ask you like, hey, developer, I want to post a discount code during the next 3 weeks on a website. Could you make that happen? Where out of just dev and ops, you're not really going to get out of that. So that's where I talk about team collaboration. Any team within your organization could become part of the DevOps lifecycle, and you're going to automate your workloads, deploying, testing, integrating security, you name it, and it's becoming part of your project cycles. And I could spend a lot of time, which I don't have, on each and every stage in DevOps. But easy said, you're going to start in the middle, the planning phase, From there, you're going to create it. Think of ARM templates, Terraform templates, your application source code, whatever language you're using. You want to validate it, and eventually you're going to package it. Like my artifact, my application source code is live. It's been tested by the developers, and now we're going to push it out, moving it into a running state. That's what we call release. Once it's running in dev and test, canary, early adopter, or full production, that's where the operations team actually starts doing most of the work by validating it. Is it still running? What's the performance like? What's the security like? Oh, we got a security incident. We need to patch our servers. Or I need to patch my Windows client like I actually had to do a couple of minutes before starting session. So the moderators were getting a little bit nervous. Sorry for that, but it's Windows updates that are sometimes pretty important. So, and from there, you go back to your planning phase, back to the creation, back to the developing, and that's where the DevOps is, that continuous motion. Now, on top of the technology, I would say it's even more important to focus on culture. Like, how can we glue all those different teams together? And it's only 40% tooling. Where now I'm talking about Azure DevOps, but in the end, it should not really matter if it's Azure DevOps or some other automation tool. But you'll find out that Azure DevOps is pretty open, pretty broad in interacting, allowing you to bring in other technologies as well. So in short, Azure DevOps is a cloud-based application service running as a cloud service. You could also deploy it on premises if you are working in an organization where public cloud is totally out of the question, or maybe it's out of the question for production, but you want to start looking into it. Know that a lot of the capabilities in Azure DevOps, the cloud version that I'm going to use, is identical to your on-prem Azure DevOps server infrastructure. We have Azure Boards, that's the project management, Azure Pipelines, that's the actual deployment engine. Azure Repos is source control. So if you're familiar with Git or GitHub or GitLab, Azure Repos could be a perfect alternative for that. Azure Task Plan is specifically focused on the development, functional testing, user testing, where you're going to simulate like operations in your application, typically something a developer would do like out of Visual Studio or IntelliJ or any other development environment. And now you're going to bring this pipeline testing as part of your DevOps cycle. And then Azure Artifacts is where you can interact with package managers. So if you're familiar with .NET, it would be NuGet. If you're using Node or Java, it would be NPM or Maven, pip for Python. So, and maybe using Azure Artifacts as a central point where the benefit could be, instead of having your developers, each and every one, connecting to the package managers online, grabbing whatever version of the package they want, that now it could all be centralized out of your DevOps team, out of Azure Artifacts. So the starting point, as I said, is source control. So what is source control? It's where you're going to store and upload all your source code. Could be application source code, could be scripts, could be ARM templates, Terraform templates, and I'll show you later on what it looks like. Again, if you're compatible with any other Git source control version, Git command line is an interesting one. GitHub, most obviously, but GitLab, Bitbucket, and a couple of other ones, they're all based on the same Git standard, which means that you could perfectly integrate the existing ones you have with Azure DevOps pipelines in the next step, or why not migrating to Azure Repos end-to-end. And everything that comes with the nice tool called Git, like the commit, the branching, pull requests, like if you have application source code and some other developer is writing another piece of the application code, and at some point in time you want to glue and merge the two worlds together or the two updates together, that's where pull requests and branching would come in. Once you have your source code, you probably switch to project management. And you could, obviously debate, like, shouldn't we start with project management before we actually going to do something? Where I think the logic part is that most probably, even before you started using Azure DevOps, you already have your source code, because you probably started writing ARM templates like 5 years ago, Terraform templates like maybe 3 years ago, and application source code like maybe even 25 years ago. I don't know. Where now the next step is your project management. That's where Azure DevOps Boards comes in. And project management could be seen from a development perspective, where you're going to interact with Scrum, with Agile. But if you are pretty new to the dev world and completely new to the DevOps world, you don't have to use Scrum and Agile. So you could start with what we call a basic plan, and giving you some work items, as we call it, to create, for example, reporting to-do tasks. Like, I want Peter to work on this task, or Peter needs to finish 15 tasks. And then later on, we can actually reuse the work items or the intelligence out of the work items into source control. Whenever a developer is checking in code, that it's linked to the work item. If somebody's trying to check in code and there is no work item, that we're actually going to create one. And taking it one step further, we're going to allow a deployment of some workload, like my virtual machine-based scenario, for example, only when we have X amount of bugs. If we have more bugs, it means Peter is a bit too lazy, or the bug is a bit too complex, and we're not going to release anything new before we're going to fix the problem. So that's a little bit what source control, project management, and eventually the pipelines later on will help you with. And that should be my first demo. So I'm working in my Azure DevOps environment. If you're wondering how you can get started, you go to dev.azure.com, and it's going to ask you for an Azure Active Directory account. You need some admin credentials to do that. Or if you start from the Azure portal and you search for DevOps, you're going to see there's two different scenarios. You got DevOps Starter and Azure DevOps Organizations. The one I'm going to use, obviously, is Azure DevOps Organizations. DevOps Starter is like a super lightweight edition. It's providing a pipeline. You can choose between Azure DevOps in the backend or GitHub Actions, a pipeline tooling from within GitHub. And I would say it's pretty powerful and actually pretty convenient, but it's lacking the project management. It's missing some of the source control, although it is trying to integrate it as well. But for now, assume that you're going to use Azure DevOps Organizations. From there, you provide a name for your organization, like something unique. In my case, PE Tender. I mean, how original can you be? And within Azure DevOps, you're going to create your project, where any project can be some collection of source code, source control, pipelines, Azure boards for that specific project. It could be one single workload. It could be a collection of workloads. So that's a little bit up to each and one of you, I think, in the organization to decide on that.
Hi, Peter.
Hey.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a question. Yeah, it's really interesting. We have a question from Ashish. He asked this question. I would really want to know about GitOps, and can Azure DevOps help us in GitOps? That's his question.
Well, sure. I think it depends a bit on, I would say, how broad or how narrow you look at it. I would say up till now, GitOps is mainly positioned for like Kubernetes workloads, where you're going to run Git source control, like creating a new application artifact together with probably some YAML Kubernetes settings file or a Helm chart for the package management, more complex scenarios. And whenever there's a change in the source code, it's going to trigger a new build in your Kubernetes environment and triggering a publishing of some pod container. Technically, and I hope I can make it in time, I can actually show you parts of it. It's not specifically built around GitOps, but if you follow everything along in the next 30-something minutes, it should give you some pretty good idea about moving GitOps into an Azure DevOps scenario.
Yes.
And maybe let me know by the end of the session if it's answering your question or if you got some other questions on that.
Yes, I hope it answered your question, Ashish. We also have another feedback, a question actually. This is not related to DevOps. Here from Gopal. Is 007FFF name of your favorite color?
Pretty close. Yes, pretty close.
Yes, interesting question. And we also have one more question from Gopal. This one is related to DevOps. Is it possible to automate Azure SQL database deployments via Azure DevOps?
Yes, I got a demo on that. So yes, it is possible.
Yes, yeah. Let's. We look forward for the demos. All right, those are the questions so far. I'll remove myself to the screen so you can continue. Thank you.
Cool. Keep those questions coming. So Azure Boards, our project management. So no secrets here. It's work items. So like to-do tasks, and you can define a couple of different scenarios. A bug is probably quite obvious. If there's something wrong with an ARM template or application, like something is not always working, like when I click this button, it works, but not from an iPhone, that could be like a bug in your application. And eventually in DevOps, you're going to work with sprints. It's coming a little bit from Scrum and Agile, but what it means is that you're going to create your collection of to-do tasks, the work items, integrating bugs, and from there, you're going to work towards some kind of deadline. That's what I think with my infrastructure background, I would call it a deadline, but a nicer word would be a sprint. And when something is not complete within the sprint, typically every 3 to 4 weeks, in most organizations, if you're Twitter, Facebook, Netflix, you have a sprint every end of the day, which means that during that time frame, you're going to hopefully fix a lot of bugs. You're going to introduce new features and technically flagging off like outstanding work items. That's what you can manage here. There's some nice overviews where you can follow along. It's a little bit slow. Come on. So there's a swim lane concept, as we call it, where you could create new items from here. You could move items out of your work item list in what we call the swim lanes. And this could be a swim lane for ARM template development, a swim lane for dev and test environment, a different one for production, or using a swim lane for the status of your work items, like the progress of your to-do tasks, where the first column could be like, this is what I need to work on. The middle one is I'm working on this. And the last one is this is completed. And maybe after a week, when there's no bug coming back or bug request coming back, we're going to remove it from the list of items. There's a lot more, but there's also a lot more that I need to show you. So moving on to the next topic, Azure Repos. So that's where your source control is. And the nice thing is that you can literally integrate with Git again on your local machine. So you could start with storing your source code. This is a sample application. And you could clone it to your local machine using VS Code integration, Visual Studio or any other development environment. If you go like, well, too bad, I'm using something else, then what's in this list, so I can't use Azure DevOps? Obviously, you can. You just need to switch back to or the Git integration out of your development environment, or going back to the Git command line on your local machine, and from there still having that interaction and integration. Once you have your local source code on your local machine, you're going to make changes in Visual Studio, VS Code, doesn't really matter. At some point, you want to check back. You're going to check in your code and eventually becoming commits, where Azure DevOps, again, is keeping track of all the commits happening. This is from the last 5-6 years because I took over an existing project. And it's providing you that history where for each and every step, it's going to show you the changes. So this would be the new code on the right-hand side, and this would be the old code. And there is some color integration, if you can obviously see it, where the red marks means like this is removed, and the green one is this is new, this is added, to give you some notion. If you're not using this out of your development environment, you could still go back to Azure DevOps and getting a view on that.
Actually, Peter, we have a question here.
Good.
A question is from Ashish. He says that my team uses Jira for project management and tasks and bug tracking, so we do not use Azure boards. Is there any integration possible between Jira and Azure DevOps boards?
Yes, there is. So I would need to check. I think there's a marketplace extension, and I'll switch to the Azure DevOps marketplace for some other capabilities. But I think there is some kind of agent integration possible between Jira and Azure DevOps for the project management, where you're still going to create your items in Jira, but then whenever there's something new happening, or later on when we do have a pipeline running, that it's actually sending information back to Jira project management. Definitely possible.
Thank you.
So we're now at the stage where we have our DevOps team. We know who's working on what, or at least supposed to be working on what. We have the project managers. We have the source code, where we asked our dev team, like, can you please upload, synchronize your source code in Azure repos, or GitHub could also be used, or any of the other Git compatible tools. And we asked our technical teams from the sysadmin side, ARM templates, Terraform templates, whatnot, can you please move them, copy them, branching, pull requesting them into Azure repos, where now we're ready to build our pipelines. Now, pipelines are interesting and complex at the same time. Now, in short, a pipeline is nothing more than a step-by-step task sequence. If you come in with a developer experience, and let's say it's a .NET application, that's what I'm using, it means that you need to install the NuGet package manager. You're going to run the NuGet package update. You're going to run some kind of .NET build, alike command line task, maybe integrating some testing, and eventually creating like a web deploy package in a web application. Or if you have your ARM template, you don't have to go through all those steps because there's nothing to compile. If you have a NuGet package, if you have a Java app, it would be the same, but obviously using different tasks. So in short, it's taking a few steps back, not changing anything in the process that you've been using before using the DevOps automation, but now you're going to automate it. You're going to create an Azure CLI script, Azure PowerShell script to maybe run an ARM template deployment. And from there, you're going to publish your web application, maybe your SQL Azure database. I do have a demo on that I can show you. That would be the idea. Now, within a pipeline scenario, there's at least two different stages. One is what we call a build stage, and that's where you're going to validate, where you're going to compile the code, for example, but it's not running or it's not moved in a running state. That's what we call release. So within Azure DevOps, when you want to create a pipeline, and it's one of the so many features, but probably the most important one, today you can choose between what we call classic pipelines and YAML-based pipelines. Classic is, I would say, following a little bit of the traditional Microsoft graphical interfacing, where you don't always need to know how something works, but if you can click around and you can search for it, you probably can build something. Where YAML is obviously using a code-based syntax, looks a little bit like JSON, but it's a little bit slightly different. And why switching from classic to YAML? Because it's really the shift of the industry. If you're working with Kubernetes clusters, you also use YAML. If you use Ansible, for example, to run configuration as code, they're also using YAML. And obviously, Azure DevOps is using YAML. GitHub Actions, the pipeline engine from GitHub, is also using YAML. So it makes probably a lot of sense to actually shift in that direction. And showing you a couple of examples, what it looks like. So we're moving on in the stack. We're now in pipelines. Some of them are green, some of them are failing, but it's just part of my demo environment. And let's create a new one to quickly show you the outcome of it. So you're going to select your source control. So it could be Azure repos, could be any of the other mentioned scenarios. Selecting your repository based on the source code, based on what you want to publish. It's going to try and help you. So this is my .NET application, and I do have my pipeline. It's really that easy. It's nothing harder than this. Within the pipeline, obviously, YAML syntax can become a little bit tricky, but you define a trigger. It means whenever something's changing in my source code, in this case, the master branch, which I know should be the main branch, but this is a 6-year-old project. So that's why it's still pointing to master. Next, we're going to define the Azure DevOps servers, like virtual machines pre-built for you, running Windows Server 2019 or 2016 or Ubuntu or Mac. Those are like the 3 different flavors we offer. If you want to use something else, like maybe Server 2008 or some Ubuntu flavor with specific tools installed, you could also use what we call self-hosted agents. And then next, that's where the actual pipeline starts. We define steps where task 1 is I need to install NuGet. Task 2 is I want to run NuGet. Task 3 is running Visual Studio Build with some command line options. And last, we're going to run some Visual Studio testing. And that's where the functional testing, user testing could come in to simulate actions in your app. Like if it's an e-commerce example, what I'll use later on, it's allowing you to test simulating like a user logging on, becoming a customer, ordering a product, paying for it, getting an email with an invoice, stuff like that, without actually deploying your application. That's what YAML is doing. If you want to do the same with Classic, sometimes it feels that it's actually becoming more complex in Classic than in YAML. I think it just depends on like what you want to use. So same starting point, my source control, my repository, the branch I want to use. So let's do a PDT branch. That's one I created. It's still the .NET ASP application. And if all works out fine, there we go. It's going to provide the exact same steps. Compiling any or producing any .NET-based application starts with having NuGet, running NuGet restore to grab all the packages, building the solution like compiling it. If you want testing, and eventually we're going to publish an artifact. Why are we publishing an artifact? Because that will become the starting point for the deployment release where we actually going to publish it. Imagine that you don't want to use testing for now because we need to speed up the sessions a little bit, for example. You can easily disable it. If you want to add something new, you can click the plus sign. You're going to search for it. I want to integrate something called Azure PowerShell. That's what our sysadmins have been using for the last 5 years. And we're going to move this up and down, no matter where you want to move it. And completing the script file path, which goes back to repos. Or if you want to create a little script in here, you could also do that like new AZ group create, AZ group, new AZ group something. I don't know. I'm not that good in Azure PowerShell anymore. Could be Azure CLI. Again, if you're using another environment, if you want to target AWS, you're going to search for AWS. And we provide Terraform as an integration. We have the AWS toolkit like command line out of AWS, and a few other scenarios are also possible. If you're using VMware on-prem, we got a couple of snippets out of Azure DevOps Marketplace that you can choose from as well. So that's where it's, again, mainly cloud-based, I would say, but it's not limited to cloud. From there, you're going to run the pipeline. And to speed up the demo a little bit, I'm just going to grab one that already ran, I think, like Tuesday this week. Pretty okay, I guess.
Hi, Peter. It's me again.
Hey.
I'm back from the background.
Good.
Wanted, yes, a really great demo you're doing right now. I'm learning a lot from you as well. We have a question from Ashish again. This is his question. Why do we need to publish symbols path in my build pipeline?
I think, well, that's just part of that pre-built template. So it's more like a sample pipeline, I would say. Actually, never really checked in depth what that specific task was doing. I think it's because in the repos in the source control, it's having some characters for variables like underscore, the variable name, and then underscore at the end to identify like, hey, this is a variable that's getting replaced during running that build pipeline. I think that's mainly what we're doing there. We could actually check back. So out of that pipeline run, it's going to start up running the pipeline. And step one, it's going to copy your source code from your Azure repos into that build agent, where again, it's an Azure running VM or it's a virtual machine on-prem. And technically in the backend, it's relying on Git. So it's literally running Git commands to copy from Azure DevOps repos into that build server. Next, it's going to install NuGet because that's the task we defined. Installing NuGet, not in the DevOps environment, but in that build virtual machine. Running the package restore. That's what's happening here. All the intelligence from my app, like the e-commerce integration and whatnot. Compiling the application, similar to what you would do in like Visual Studio, right-click, build, right-click, rebuild. And then obviously the next step would be right-click, publish, where we are now automating everything with pipelines. And then eventually publishing an artifact. What is an artifact? It's like a web application scenario here. So it's going to become a web zip package. And it's dropping it literally in some kind of location. And that becomes the starting point for the actual deployments. You could also move over to more complex or more advanced scenario. I'll actually show you later on. I'm first going to talk about release, because you probably want to see something in action, right? So the build pipeline, but I don't like the focus on build anymore, and I'll explain that later on. But in any DevOps project, you're probably going to have some build stage, like we're going to compile, we're going to test, we're going to do whatever we need to do, but it's not running yet. Where the second step, making it over into a running state, that's where we call, or where we talk about release. So the release is where you're going to move it into a running state, publishing it to Azure in an Azure Dev subscription, in a production subscription, in AWS, in VMware, using Google Cloud or on-prem servers. You got plenty of options where, again, you're reusing all the information you already have and just moving it into a task pipeline. So what's this pipeline? Not going to make it too boring, but it's almost the same as what I did earlier, creating a step-by-step task sequence.
Actually,
So-
Peter, we have a question before you continue.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the question is from Rajesh. He asks artifact. Oh, I should show the question. He says that artifacts published by the pipeline will have redundancy. Will they be managed by Azure?
I have no idea what he means by that, like having it managed by Azure. It's becoming part of the Azure DevOps backend storage, and that's where it's waiting to be used. So I'll try to show you. So when you run a pipeline, I switched to another project because it maps with the scenarios I mentioned at the beginning. But out of running this pipeline, it's going to provide you some warnings about, hey, watch out, this application needs some updates, but it's on purpose. And the artifact ends up here, where if I click through, it's going to show me that drop location. It's like the default location in Azure DevOps. And this is my e-commerce application that I'll show you in a minute, waiting to be published. So if the question is around, like, is this stored somewhere in Azure? Not really. It's part of the Azure DevOps service. Or if it has another notion to the question, then you might need to clarify that a little bit. Sorry for that.
Sure. We also have another question from Gabriel. He says, can you get the AI and DevOps pipelines to work together with Azure?
Yeah, why not? It's just a pipeline automation task. So I wouldn't see why not. Even if you look at like the data platform pipelines, they're technically integrating with Azure DevOps as well. So should be totally fine to do that. I don't have a real experience because I'm not too much into AI, but I don't see why not.
And we have a comment here from Gopal. He says that I think artifacts stay in the DevOps for 30 days as default, and then they get deleted.
Yeah, but you can customize that. It's an overall project and organization setting. Because if you have a pipeline that's like running, I don't know, twice a year, if you're only updating your app like twice a year, then obviously the 30 days would be a bit too short, and that's where you could customize it. But it's not that you can connect to some Azure storage account and grab them from there. It would all be happening from within Azure repos and the drop folder.
Okay, thank you so much.
Cool. So if you think back about some of the possible scenarios, got only 4 or 5 of them. So one of the first ones was, I have a virtual machine scenario. I want to publish Azure VMs. I want to publish a web application. I want to publish a database and make it happen. So the starting point was my repo, where I do have my ARM templates in my dev ARM. It's just the name of the application. So all my ARM templates are in here, where my actual web application is in a different repo, but it's still belonging to the same project, with all the commits, branches, everything I already talked about. Next, I created a pipeline to compile my web application or to validate my ARM templates, where now we're going to move to release. So my release in my first example is deploy an IaaS scenario. So what we're going to do here is defining that we're going to start from this artifact. It's the outcome of our build stage, and we're going to move it into a target environment. I only have one here, but if you want, you could create a new one. And since we're publishing an app service, we could flag this one. And in the back, we're back in our step-by-step task sequence. So this is deploying an app service, but I also need my SQL database deploy, Azure SQL database deploy, and probably we want to have the database before the web app. Down here, we provide some settings, hard-coded or using variables that we do have. Up here as well. I'll show you for an actual pipeline how that works. And that's how you run it, and it's going to get published. Then we eventually, in the back down here, it's grabbing the application source code out of that artifact package in the pipeline step 1, publishing it to some Azure web app, and that's basically it. How does it know what package it needs to use? Because that's where it's going to look for that zip file in that drop folder location. And it's all using dynamic system variables. If you want to change it to your custom locations within Azure DevOps, you could technically do that as well. So I'll kick off this pipeline. Create release. It's grabbing this source code in my production environment. Oh, let's check back what we defined as settings. Some unique name, location, West Europe, and all other variables for my ARM templates are now out of the ARM templates parameter file, and they're now stored in Azure DevOps, guaranteeing that anyone who's running the pipeline is always having all the variables available. I'm creating a resource group with CLI. I'm copying some files to Azure Storage, eventually running the pipeline. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. Simulating, automating what we did before. Create release, and it is running. From here, it's going to give you the exact same look and feel as what I showed you with the build pipeline. It's probably moving into a queue first, but that's because of our internal subscriptions. And eventually, this is getting kicked off and running. I'm not going to wait for it. I'm going to show you the outcome. It's creating a resource group with virtual machines where I'm running a web VM, I'm running a SQL VM, and I promised you an e-commerce environment. And this is my workload. A web workload connecting to a SQL virtual machine backend. I deployed this script like 3-4 years ago already, and eventually moved everything into a pretty straightforward pipeline. In meantime, it is running, so it's going to give you some information. Deployment is in progress. I can see that it's targeting my Azure subscription because it got the credentials for that. It's deploying something in West Europe, and that step in meantime is done. Next, it's switching to the file copy. It's going to grab the storage account token. That's where it's storing the web files, and eventually running that ARM template deployment. I could show you the same, but you probably already figured that out, that you could run the same deploying a PaaS scenario. What is my PaaS scenario looking like? Starting from the same artifact. It's my compiled web application, the exact same one that I used in my IaaS pipeline. Nothing's changing. That's what my developers have been working on. The only difference is now my tasks are slightly different. I'm running Azure CLI, and that's answering the question that came up. Can I deploy a SQL Azure database? Sure, you can. How to do that? For example, that's what I did using Azure CLI, because you already know I'm not that good with Azure PowerShell. So I'm running a sequence of tasks, and technically I have 5 of them, but this could be one long CLI script that most probably your cloud team already has before they started using Azure DevOps. What I'm doing here is creating an Azure group, and it's picking up variables using that $, and any keyword within brackets would be a variable. Next, creating an Azure SQL server and setting the firewall that it allows all Azure communication. Otherwise, I cannot really remote into it. Next, I have a second script. And again, this could be one long script where I'm creating the database. Got another one where I'm creating a new fresh web application in Azure together with a service plan. Running CLI to import my SQL database. My SQL database is stored in an Azure Blob storage. Up here, I'm connecting to it, and from there it's running that CLI-based import. And then we go back to a traditional built-in release task where I'm stepping out of CLI, although technically I could use CLI like I did for SQL to deploy the other tasks, and eventually pointing to deploy it to this Peter subscription in Azure, the web app on Windows because it's .NET, and the app service name is going to be something unique coming again from those variables. The exact same ones that I used in my IaaS pipeline.
Yes. Hi, Peter. It's me again.
Hey.
We have a lot of, thank you. We have a lot of interesting interactions and good feedback about your demo. They really like the demo, the step-by-step instructions. And we also have a new question from Ashish.
Good.
I think this is related to the demo that you just showed. The question is, these variables, I end up having many build and release variables for my pipelines. This is difficult to remember and keep control of. Is there a way to configure variables as text file?
Good question. If you're using the YAML version of the pipelines, then it's becoming part of your YAML syntax. So that could be an option. Another option is storing them, for example, in Key Vault or in Azure App Configuration, if you're familiar with that one. So again, it's just one of the so many options. I like to have them in my pipelines because that's where I'm working most. But apart from that, storing them in Key Vault because most of the variables could contain something secretly as well. And I'll actually talk about how to handle that in a security topic in the next couple of minutes. But a text file would be like probably the easiest from a YAML perspective.
Thank you, Peter. We also have another question right now from another audience, Rajesh. What is the best way to pass client ID, client secret subscription, etc. variables to build release pipeline? Maybe pipeline variables, or is there a better way?
Yeah, so the Azure DevOps built-in approach to do that is a service connection. So what I did, because I showed you the Microsoft, my internal Microsoft subscription here, but obviously how does Azure DevOps knows about it, right? So it's not that the pipeline is running in my admin account, my Azure admin account. So the best practice for governance reasons for the defining, locking down the admin permissions, you would create a service principal, and you probably know service principals from other application integration, where now Azure DevOps, although it runs on Azure, is also relying on that service principal. So you create a service principal, and from here, you're going to create a new service connection. In our case, it's Azure, but again, if you're targeting AWS, it's going to be something different. If you're targeting Docker to create containers, it's going to be slightly different. If you're targeting or interacting with, there we go, Jira, question came up. You create a Jira connection service, and from there you can start interacting with third-party platforms. And there's a lot more than what's visible in that list here, but that should give you some idea. So if you go for Azure Resource Manager, if you do have the correct permissions to create a service principal overall, you can do that from here. But in typical scenarios, as a DevOps engineer, you probably don't have the permission in Azure AD to create a service principal, and you would copy that information down here.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter.
No worries there. Now, the release is running. It published my e-commerce virtual machine. I could kick off the PaaS one. I could kick off the container one. It's all based on the same concept. You have the artifact out of the build, and from there, you have the release target some environment where I release to production right away because I only have one environment, but you could build multiple stages, publishing to development, publishing to Q&A, publishing to production, publishing to 5 subscriptions on Azure, 2 subscriptions in AWS, or 5 virtual machines on-prem, and even mixing all those together. Where it becomes really, I would say, even more magic is with release optimization. What you can do with release optimization is, for example, validating Azure policies. The example I shared all the way at the start of the session, what's the point of publishing my environment, in my case, to West Europe, if out of my cloud team, out of my sysadmins, there is a policy that I cannot deploy something, or I cannot deploy this specific workload in West Europe because I'm not allowed to do that, or because my ARM template for my virtual machine is having some super big beefy virtual machine and my business doesn't want to pay for it, where they're going to rely on policies. So what we can do with release pipelines is, before the pipeline runs, actually creating an integration with Azure policy, like, hey, can you validate the policy? And if something is not compliant, I'm not even allowing you to run the deployment. Or if you're not using Azure policies, but you still want to have some kind of interaction with Azure, or another platform could also work in this case, you could use REST APIs. Anything that's running on Azure is technically driven by REST APIs. So you could run a REST API call, triggering a webhook, running a web job, again, towards Azure, towards a third-party running web application, targeting AWS and doing something with it. Or if you're familiar with Azure Functions, running some scheduled task or a trigger task, kicking off a PowerShell script that you used before, that you now moved into Azure Function. Before the pipeline is literally running in a release, it's going to run that Azure function. And based on the feedback from the Azure function, like HTTP 200, everything's fine, you're good to go. HTTP, 404 is like, oh, something is not active on the backend. And that's why we're not releasing. Like if your, Azure storage account is down, or an Azure region should have an outage, or you're targeting a service that doesn't exist in that region, again, your pipeline is going to fail. And nobody really likes seeing failed pipelines, I think. Having a lot more green is always positive. And that's where the pipeline quality gates, as we call it, could be used. Or back to our starting point, where Peter is a bit lazy and having a lot of open to-do tasks or a lot of bugs because I'm not that good of a developer. And based on a query, like if you have more than 50 to-do tasks, I'm going to block you from releasing because you first need to work on your outstanding tasks, something like that. And showing you what it looks like is still a good project, yes. Back in pipelines, back in release, and I got one example, one example with policies. It's the summer allergy season. So every now and then it's breaking up my voice a little bit. And I'll show you the outcome. So initially, when I created this pipeline, I extended the release gates. I'll show you in a second how it works. And the idea is that you're going to kick off the pipeline manual way or a scheduled task like Friday night, 5 o'clock, run my pipeline. And the first thing it's going to do is validating the Azure policy. At 10:45, it was failing because the policy was blocking me 15 or 5 minutes after you can tune. If you want to check every hour, every 4 days, you could obviously tune that. Still policy violation. And eventually I cleared the policy. I went to my cloud team like, oh, can you please allow me to deploy something in West Europe? Oh, yeah, sure, because we know you're going to do a demo on Saturday. And eventually I was okay to deploy my workload. Another example that's based on the exact same logic is, for example, integrating with Azure Monitor. If you're not familiar with Azure Monitor, it's the Azure monitoring tool. And based on, for example, alerts, like, hey, something's wrong with Azure, we're going to block you from deploying. Or maybe you could run it in a different way, where you're going to send a validation to Azure Monitor. Can you please check if my web app performance, like CPU, memory load, and whatnot, is within specific metrics? If my CPU load, my memory load goes like through the roof, and my CPU is spiking 90% of the load for the next, I don't know, or the past 15, 20, 25 minutes, that could actually become a green light for running a new deployment. Where now, instead of having one web app running, you're going to have 2 of them, 5 of them, or you're going to deploy them in a different region. That could be the idea. So how do you define it? It's the exact same pipeline concept that I showed you before, starting from our artifact, the compiled application, still the same tasks, but what happened here? This time in my pipeline, that's where I needed to be, I can define pre and post validations. One validation could be your team leads or your manager, whoever's working on the project, allowing a pre-approval or forcing an approval, where you're going to define like, this person, obviously it doesn't make a lot of sense to approve my own pipelines, just showing you how easy it is to configure. When I kick off this pipeline, this individual needs to approve it. Or if you go to a team, it's called oh, my keyboard layout got messed up a little bit. There we go, the fast car team. Those are my DevOps engineers. Anyone from that team can approve it. Or I need 3 approvals, or I need 2 approvals, but in a sequence where colleague 1 first needs to approve it, colleague 2 is next, and from there we're going to run it. So that's also possible. The examples I shared with the quality gate, so Azure policy, functions, monitoring integration, is what you define up here, together with some settings. So like validate more and Peter's work items, where I pre-created a query like filter all Peter's open issues. And if I have more than 5, fix my keyboard, there we go, more than 5, that's where the pipeline will be moved into a pausing state. From there, you can validate like every 5 minutes, but since Peter is a little bit lazy, we're going to do this every, I don't know, 5 hours, maybe. Let's do that every 5 hours. After 5 hours, it's going to run that validation check again. And yes, Peter was performing a little bit, and finally they got the green light to actually run the deployment. If you got multiple stages like Q&A, dev and test production, or Canary early adopter and eventually release, or you got 50 different stages, you could obviously customize that for each and every one of them. Cool, we're almost there. Going to do a little time check. I think it's a bit after, but I hope it's all fine and you still enjoy it.
Yeah, sure. Actually, Peter, we had a question on your previous demo. He is from Gopal. He asks, what are the gates here?
The gates is just terminology for like being in front of the gate, and that's where like the gatekeeper, the security officer, if you want, is going to validate like what are your conditions. Like if you want to enter, imagine we were traveling, but we're not traveling for now. But if you want to travel, you need to have a passport. Your TSA agent in the US or the border control overall is going to run some validation like, hey, who are you? Is your ID correct? Do you have a flight ticket? If all those validations are fine, you're allowed to enter. And that's what the release gates in DevOps, Azure DevOps terminology is doing. So just terminology. some control mechanism, a control gate that validates if you have the green light to run the deployment or the red light to block you from deploying it. So back to that DevOps motion. And again, the ultimate idea is automating everything. I hope that some of my demos, although it's pretty fast, gives you some idea about how you could create some magic for yourself, where the developer comes in, providing some validation if you want to integrate, I don't know, PowerShell scripts and you want to run faster for like PowerShell syntax testing, or you want to run CLI or PowerShell scripts with like a what if function, or you want to run Terraform in it and plan but not running it yet. So that's everything in the validate stage. Eventually, you're going to package your artifact or creating an artifact, packaging your application, and you're going to run it. And eventually, all the way at the end, that's where the monitoring comes in. Each and every step for now has been automated or can be automated. But the next part is around how can we handle security? Now, why is security important? Because we're doing it wrong for the last 10, 15 years. Why? Because if you look at that traditional flow, although we have a lot of stakeholders, a lot of DevOps team members, security is typically validated all the way at the end, which means we have the application running, we have the firewall integration. We're going to make sure that only authorized Azure admins can touch the Azure resources. We have an anti-malware on servers up and running. We have web app firewall for application services and whatnot, but it's actually too late in the cycle. Why? Because that's where typically security incidents are happening. So what we're going to do is what the industry calls shifting left. What is shifting left? It means that we're going to start integrating our security as early in the stage as possible to, for example, avoid something like this. This is based on a real scenario out of my own example. So a few months ago, the end of January, I was providing an Azure DevOps workshop out of Microsoft role and literally showing how to create a service principal, how to create a service connection, how to interact with some third-party platform tool, and literally showing everything in live demos during a week. Now, there was one gentleman in my audience, but I was not aware of that, and actually recording the sessions, where at the end of the day, on a Monday or Tuesday evening, January 28th, within just a couple of minutes after the session was done, my credentials were available on GitHub because this gentleman created a little GitHub repo with some complex name to try and fool the platform and creating a JSON file. In that JSON file was my credential, my personal access token, like an authentication key for Azure DevOps, together with 500-600 other keys that he probably stole from anywhere else. I don't know. What is nice, I was using Azure DevOps. I was using GitHub as my repository, although I could have used Azure repos as well. And within just a couple of minutes, GitHub actually warned me about it. How is it doing that? I'll show the link to the website, but GitHub has intelligence baked in that whenever you store secrets for Azure SQL databases, storage account keys, AWS keys, and a whole bunch of other cloud applications, when you have that information in your repos, it's immediately flagging like, hey, watch out, we're not even storing those credentials anymore, or at least informing you about it. So the solution to this is integrating security into your pipelines. How can you integrate security? You go to the Azure DevOps Marketplace public website, and the latest update, this is a screenshot I updated this morning, is 74. So there are 74 different tools out of the box available for Azure DevOps that gives you security extension. What we're going to do is moving to what the industry calls DevSecOps, keeping the dev environment, integrating with the ops environment, and now we're going to squeeze in security. Although I told you, like shift left, move it as early in the stage as possible, somehow it's positioned, but every now and then you find some other notions like a Sec DevOps, emphasizing that security should come first, but I think overall agreement is that it should be DevSecOps. So my new definition becomes integrating security from the start. And then back to the culture, 70% of culture, because your team is expanding, your security team, the network team, the firewall team, the compliance team is now becoming part of your DevOps team members. And we're going to take a little step away from the focus on the tooling because it's already there, it's integrated, and nothing's changing. Probably one of my last demos, I need another last 5 minutes or so, where we're going to do the same thing. Back to our pipelines, not going to change anything. Where in the build stage, I told you it's like a 5-year-old web application, which probably means that the packages we're using, the source code we're using, the credentials we're storing are probably not always that secure. So we have the exact same pipeline that I used like 30 minutes ago. And this time we're going to inject a security code scanning. I'm using one of the 74 tools, Sonar Cloud, because it's easy to demo and easy to use. What we're going to do is keeping the pipeline we have. So these were the steps we had earlier, like 4 steps where I disabled the testing, remember? And now we're just going to reuse the same pipeline. I created a second one just for the sake of the demo and adding some security integration. So you go to that Azure DevOps Marketplace, marketplace.visualstudio.com, and you search for security because we don't want to pinpoint any vendor in front of another one. They're all doing a good job. It's really in the details. There's not even a preference on like who's better than any other one. It's just randomly showing you 74, where some of them are specific for some workloads. Some of them are really good in detecting .NET code issues, but maybe a little bit less on Java or Node. Or, for example, Aqua is specifically focused on container workloads, where the idea would be that if you have a container workload, you have your source code, you're going to create a pipeline creating some Docker task, Docker build, Docker push, Docker run. Now moving that, it's because I was activating my light, and apparently it had some influence here as well. How do I get back? Oh, that's good. Where you could move into your tasks, creating a Docker build, Docker run, Docker push, moving it into Docker Hub or an Azure Container Registry. And as part of your build stage, interacting with Aqua Security Scanning. It's going to compile your container, and during that compile process, it's going to run security validation. To give you some idea what Sonar Cloud is doing, this is my project, and it's going to identify code vulnerabilities. And it's literally going to show you in your home controller, that's like the home page, class. I have some parts in my application source code that are not secure or not as secure as it should be. And it's going to highlight like, oh, this is a public statement, which in .NET source code means that the whole application could actually use this controller. If you switch it to private, it means that only this specific web page could actually call it, which could obviously make it a lot more secure. Or it identifies, for example, your outstanding bugs. Like these are all the projects that, or the tasks that Peter needs to fix in the next coming weeks and months. And it could also identify what we call code smell or technical debt, like having outdated source code, having like 50 snippets of code getting repeated over and over, where it could be a lot more beneficial to have one class and having pointers to that class, which means if you need to fix that snippet of code, you only need to change it once and not changing it 50 times, which again could make it more vulnerable. Where next you could integrate this. So this is the build stage. Whenever the build stage is running, you already know we're going to eventually publish it. Where now we could go back to release. And within our definition, similar to Azure policies, similar to Azure Monitor REST API integration, I could now go into my quality gates and telling that before my pipeline is actually running, on top of everything we talked about before, I want you to validate the Sonar Cloud decision. If Sonar Cloud tells me this project is still secure enough to get released, that's totally fine. If Sonar Cloud figures out like, oh my God, this code is so bad because Peter is not that good of a developer, because it's outdated, because the NuGet packages are the old ones and whatnot, I'm going to define out of Sonar Cloud that it's like a red state. It's going to block me from actually publishing. And that's what we call, again, shifting left, moving the security scanning all the way to the starting point. The same for the variables. I briefly touched on it. But if you create a variable group, instead of what I did for now, hard coding them, you could now store them in Key Vault. A safe place, secret store. Azure DevOps is just pulling them up, never having the actual credentials. And they're not even stored in Azure DevOps, which means that there's no security vulnerability for your DevOps team as well, where they might potentially have more permissions and reading out the secrets. No way to do that with Azure Key Vault. And I think with that, we're at the end. I know I'm like 10 minutes over time, but I briefly touched on source control, Azure repos, or some other compatible format. As long as it's using Git, you're good to go. Project management, the Azure boards, or like the gentleman mentioned, Jira, perfectly fine. Source validation, running the build stage in YAML, in Classic, optimizing security integrations, everything I showed you, actually running the deployments, publishing the workloads, from build to release, reusing the artifacts. Once you have your artifact in one scenario, you can literally replicate from IaaS deployments, build me my VMs out of an ARM template, a Terraform template, and all the way at the end, squeeze in my web application artifact, doing the same with PaaS out of the CLI tasks that I showed you with Azure Web App Service, Azure SQL Server, Azure SQL Database, import jobs, and all the way at the end, closing with some security optimization. I'm going to show my credentials here. Feel free to reach out. But back to our two moderators. Any other questions coming up? I can give you another couple of minutes to make sure that all the questions are covered before we're going to start getting wasted on a Saturday night.
Yes. Yeah. We went beyond our time, Peter, but you really have like a great session, great demo. I learned a lot, and our audience also stayed on the line live
Awesome.
with us to watch it. And great feedback about your presentation, and I hope they learned a lot as well.
It's good.
Yes, thank you.
I think this feedback is actually quite representative from Ashish. He says, thank you for a great presentation and know some tips, Peter. This is one of the best demos I have attended.
Awesome.
So,
Yeah, well, the challenge for me is squeezing this, all this in like a 1 hour and a bit session, because I'm typically doing this like 40 hours a week with whiteboarding, slides, demos. So
Yes.
should be, I think, pretty clear that it's not my first session I'm delivering online. So,
Yes.
but thanks for the feedback. Always nice and appreciate it.
We also have like, just to know, we also have an audience from New Zealand. We have one of my contacts, Ryan O'Connell, and he is also, he also loves Azure like us. And he said that he loves the step-by-step instructions that you had in your demo or presentation. So yeah.
Awesome.
Good. Yes.
I go back to my first slide. My second slide. Fourth slide. Everything I showed you, well, not everything, but most of what I showed you is actually covered in, I lost my cursor. Oh, there it is. It's a weird color. That's better. It's in this book, the first one. It's the latest one I published. It's like 4 or 5 months ago. It's migrating 2 tiers, so that web e-commerce application I showed you. The idea about the book is doing everything in a manual way. So you're going to create an ARM template to create a web VM, SQL VM, publishing the web application. Next, you're going to move it into web apps in PaaS and SQL Azure, moving it into containers. And all the way at the end, that was the new chapter that I squeezed in with the latest update. how to automate all this with pipelines, basically exactly using the demo scenario that I used for this session. So I promised you to give away one free ebook copy. I leave it up to the two of you to decide who was most active, who had the most interesting question, and let me know by Twitter or by email, and more than happy to send a free copy to that gentleman or the lady, depending who you pick.
Yes.
And then you can go through all the demos in your own time. And obviously, if there's any questions for the other ones, I'm giving away books on Twitter quite often, just because I'm not really making any money out of it anyway. And I always like anyone to learn about Azure. That's really my branding, I would say, for the last couple of years already. You brought me an audience, and I hope I shared Azure knowledge. So always happy to do so.
You surely did.
I really love that tagline that you have, and just like you, we are also passionate about sharing the knowledge to others, because I personally believe that knowledge is power. It gives, it's really great. Thank you so much, Peter. So to those of you that we will, Håkan and I will be selecting the best questions, and we will get back to you as soon as we know who is the lucky winner. And for upcoming events, feel free to follow us on Twitter, Meetup, and follow us on Twitter. We are pretty active. And follow Peter as well, Peter on Twitter.
And also, please subscribe here to our channel. That would be really nice for us. And in our outro, we will actually show again the QR code so that you can apply to our CFP. So if you have anything that you would like to present, we are always open for suggestions. So with that said, we thank you, Peter, so much for great presentation and great demos. And we thank the audience, and we hope we will see you back in our next event.
Yes, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. Have a good weekend to all of you.